Only after two iterations, we realized how quickly a local festival can morph into a national talking point. Take the holy celebrations in India this weekend, which drew millions and sparked debates about public space and inclusivity.
The numbers are striking. In Delhi alone, estimates suggest over 1.5 million people participated, and social media mentions of Holi-related events jumped by 40% compared to last year. That scale of engagement signals a shift in how people use festivals to assert cultural identity.
But does that really translate to broader social change, or is it just a temporary spike in visibility? If governments start co-opting these events, could it dilute their grassroots power?
In Brazil, the recent LGBTQ+ Pride Parade in Sao Paulo drew both massive crowds and official support, but also faced pushback from conservative groups. The tension between celebration and resistance seems to define these moments.
Here's the takeaway. When authorities respond with adaptation like providing public transport or security for these gatherings, it can legitimize the movement. But it also risks sanitizing the message. The balance between support and control is delicate.
And globally, we're seeing a pattern. In Nigeria, for example, youth-led protests this weekend over education funding were met with both solidarity marches and government crackdowns. The data shows a 25% increase in protest-related arrests compared to last month.
If these events are becoming more frequent, does that suggest a renaissance of activism, or just that governments are more reactive now? What would actually signal a lasting shift in social values?
Maybe it's both. Viral cultural phenomena, like the K-pop flash mobs in Seoul this weekend, show how digital platforms can amplify local actions into global statements, sometimes faster than institutions can respond.
Only after two iterations, we realized the scale of the weekend's protests in Sao Paulo, tens of thousands on the streets, with police deploying water cannons. Here's the takeaway. The intensity wasn't just about the immediate trigger, but a buildup of economic grievances.
That's right. If we look at the numbers, over 200 people were detained in Brazil alone, and similar unrest was reported in Lagos, Nigeria, where at least 3 major intersections were blocked by demonstrators. These events seem to correlate with recent spikes in food prices and unemployment rates.
Can we be sure these incidents are more than isolated flare-ups? If the government's response is mostly force, doesn't that risk escalating things further, especially if underlying issues aren't addressed?
In India, for example, the government's reaction was a rapid deployment of paramilitary units in Delhi after a cross-border incident in the north. But the official statement emphasized restoring order rather than engaging with protesters' demands, which could fuel more resentment.
Let's not overlook Russia. Moscow saw a significant police operation after reports of planned demonstrations. The authorities preemptively detained organizers, signaling a zero-tolerance approach. Here's the result. Public gatherings were largely suppressed, but online dissent spiked.
And in the U.S., there were smaller but coordinated protests in several cities, with some clashes in Los Angeles. The scale was less dramatic, but the pattern, quick mobilization, visible police presence, and sporadic violence mirrors what we're seeing globally.
Is there any indication these kinetic activities could mark the start of broader unrest, or are they more likely to fizzle out without systemic change?
Uncertain. But the convergence of economic stress and political dissatisfaction across continents suggests these aren't isolated. The real test will be whether governments address root causes or double down on security measures. What surprised me most was the sheer volume of governmental announcements coming out of China and Nigeria this weekend. 2 countries on different continents, yet both signaling shifts in domestic policy that could ripple outward. Here's the takeaway. We're seeing a pattern where local decisions are increasingly shaped by global pressures.
To put some numbers on that, China's new economic directive reportedly impacts over 200 million urban workers, while Nigeria's recent electoral reforms could affect voter turnout in at least 15 major states. These aren't isolated tweaks. They're structural moves with measurable consequences.
But can we really call these reforms if, for instance, the Nigerian changes might just reinforce existing power structures? If the intent is to increase transparency, why are opposition groups raising concerns about restricted access to polling data?
Only after 2 iterations of policy drafts did the Brazilian government finalize its new Environmental Oversight Board this weekend. That detail matters because it shows how internal debate can delay or reshape outcomes, especially when international investors are watching.
Let's contrast that with the United States. where the weekend was dominated by leadership maneuvering ahead of the primaries. The difference is, while Brazil's changes were policy-driven, the U.S. developments were more about political positioning and coalition building.
Russia's situation is also notable. State media reported a new round of regional appointments, with at least 3 governors replaced. Historically, such moves have preceded broader crackdowns or signaled shifts in Kremlin priorities.
If Australia's government is liberalizing migration rules, as reported, does that suggest a pivot toward regional integration, or is it simply a response to labor shortages? The context isn't entirely clear without more data.
Turkey's weekend saw a public policy shift on energy subsidies, which could be a reaction to inflationary pressures. What's interesting is how these economic levers are being used as political tools, especially in countries straddling multiple regions.
Only after 2 iterations of policy tweaks did we see India's central bank finally stabilize the rupee over the weekend, which is a clear signal of how reactive monetary authorities have become in these volatile conditions.
That's a good point. The Reserve Bank of India's intervention pushed the rupee up by 0.7% against the dollar, which is the biggest single-day gain in over a month. Meanwhile, China's stock market saw a 1.2% dip after new trade restrictions were announced, highlighting divergent regional responses.
Can we be sure these interventions are sustainable? If commodity prices keep fluctuating, central banks might burn through reserves quickly. What happens if inflation spikes again next month?
Last week, we got stuck on whether government stimulus packages actually reach small businesses. Over the weekend, Brazil's finance ministry reported that only 40% of allocated relief funds have been dispersed so far, which could explain why unemployment numbers aren't improving as fast as projected.
Here's the takeaway. Rapid policy shifts can calm markets temporarily, but unless fiscal measures are implemented efficiently, public frustration over slow economic recovery will persist. We're seeing that in the protests in Jakarta after fuel subsidy cuts.
It's also worth noting that South Korea's tech exports rebounded by 3% this weekend, suggesting that technological adoption is cushioning some economies against global shocks. That's a bright spot compared to the headwinds in commodity-dependent countries.
I partly agree, but if regional integration stalls like the delays in the ASEAN trade agreement, couldn't that undermine these gains? Interconnectedness is a double-edged sword when external shocks ripple through supply chains.
Uncertain whether these weekend trends will hold, especially with upcoming elections in several countries. Political uncertainty could easily reverse any positive momentum we're seeing right now.
Only after 2 iterations, we realized how a single Supreme Court ruling can ripple through both the legal system and public sentiment. Here's the takeaway. The weekend's decisions in several countries have already triggered debates about judicial independence and the boundaries of government intervention.
For instance, in Country X, the High Court's verdict on electoral reforms was backed by a 5-2 majority, with the dissenting opinions highlighting concerns over procedural transparency. According to the International Bar Association, similar splits often correlate with lower public trust in the judiciary.
Can you explain that in more detail? If the court's decision was so divided, does it really strengthen the rule of law, or does it just expose deeper fractures within the system?
I partly agree, but I think the context matters. In countries where the judiciary is historically strong, even controversial rulings tend to reinforce institutional legitimacy. In contrast, places with weaker legal traditions often see such decisions as evidence of political interference.
That's a good point. Data from Transparency International shows that countries with robust judicial independence score up to 30% higher in public confidence surveys than those where courts are perceived as politicized.
But what about the immediate effects? In country Y, last weekend's high-profile corruption trial ended with an acquittal, sparking protests. If the legal process is seen as fair, why is there so much public backlash?
Uncertain. It could be that the legal reasoning wasn't communicated clearly, or perhaps there's a history of similar cases leading to skepticism. Either way, these reactions show how legal outcomes shape, and are shaped by public trust.
Here's the bottom line. Whether these judicial milestones promote justice or reveal systemic cracks depends on transparency, consistency, and the willingness to address unresolved issues. Thanks to everyone for unpacking these complex dynamics. Let's keep watching how these legal decisions influence both local and global perceptions of the rule of law.